An 18-year-old girl was thrown into a deep-water well until the struggling cowboy was shocked. The wind screamed across the plains like a warning. It wasn't the kind of breeze that whispered through wheat fields or danced with the tumbleweeds. It was a roar cold and dry, whipping dust into the air and dragging with it the scent of old gunpowder and rotting wood. Something had happened out here, something still lingered. Clara Hargrove ran her feet, bare and blistered, beat against the cracked earth. Her dress, once pale blue and stitched with care by her mother, was now a tattered sheet, torn and stained by mudblood and the dry spittle of fear behind her. In the rising dusk came hooves fast, ruthless, the sound of men who didn't need to chase her. They enjoyed it. She wasn't supposed to be alive. They thought the fall had killed her. Chest burned, every breath tasted of copper, but she didn't dare stop ahead. Rising like a ghost from the grasslands was the husk of an old farmstead, broken fencing, a collapsed barn, and a single stone while its bucket missing the rope frayed. And long since forgotten, she stumbled through the field tall, prairie grass clawing at her legs. She knew they'd catch her in minutes, maybe less, but then she reached the well one, looked down its mouth black and endless, and she knew what she had to. To the only chance she had left, she turned just once, to the horizon behind her. The men were there, small but growing, like demons in a preacher's tale. Laughing, one fired a shot into the sky. Clara stepped onto the well's crumbling edge, closed her eyes, and let herself fall. The world vanished into rushing air and stone walls, and then impact cold water slammed into her like a wall. She went under, then up, gasping, arms flailing. Panic came first, then pain. The darkness of the well wrapped around her, tight and endless. She screamed. No one heard. She was not dead, but she wasn't saved either. For hours, perhaps longer, she clung to the jagged stones lining the well's edge, half-submerged, arms trembling with exhaustion. Above, only a pale slit of sky and shadows that leaned closer as night descended. Her mind spun with memory. Her father's voice reading scripture by firelight, her mother humming lullabies in a soft southern cadence, the smell of gunpowder, the men in gray, the money. Feed. Accused her of hiding it. She hadn't. But when you're the daughter of a Union sympathizer in post-war Wyoming, truth had no home. Her father had served as the town's preacher, a quiet man with fierce eyes and unshakable ideals. He had sheltered wounded Union soldiers during the final winter of the war, something no one in Marlowe forgave when the Confederacy collapsed. Those same neighbors turned their wrath on him. They burned his church, hanged him in the square. Her mother died, coughing on smoke. And grief. Weeks later, Clara was spared, or so it seemed. Men from a local Gan-Jix Confederates, hiding behind lawless land, believed the preacher had hidden gold for the Union. They came looking, and when Clara refused to give them what didn't exist, they dragged her into the prairie, beat her, and threw her into the well. Let God sort her out, they said. Now here she was trapped alone. She didn't cry. There weren't any tears left. When morning came, the light crept down the shaft in slow motion, crawling over moss and stone until it touched her face. It felt like the fingers of something divine. She didn't move. And then footsteps, not hers, not theirs. A horse snorted above. The slow, heavy thud of boots approached the well silence. Then a man's voice, low and rough. What in God's name? He knelt over the rim. She could barely see him. A shadow with a hat brim pulled low. Hello. He called again, softer this time. Clara didn't answer. Her throat was raw, her lips split, but a sound escaped her, a cough, maybe a whimper. The man leaned closer. Hold on, she heard rustling. A rope leather, then a splash of hope surged through her chest. The man's name was Jed Calloway. He'd ridden away from death too many times to fear it anymore, eh? Former Union scout, hardened by bitter winters and backroom betrayals. He'd lost most of what made him a man. His wife had died giving birth. His boy had perished 3 years later, from a fever that refused to break. All that remained was a scar. On his leg, a Colt revolver and a roan Mari with more brains than most men. He hadn't meant to find her. He'd only meant to disappear for a few days. Drink until his memories blurred ride the edges of the territory where law didn't reach, and names didn't matter. But when he passed the abandoned well and heard the sound, no louder than a bird's cry, he stopped. That kind of cry didn't come from an animal. It came from someone who didn't believe they were going to be saved. He lowered the rope, tested its weight with a hard tug, then wrapped it around a support post. He wasn't strong like he used to be. His shoulder throbbed from a wound that never healed right. But down he went, slow and steady, halfway down. He smelled the damp, the rot. Then he saw her Jesus. He breathed. She looked like a ghost, skin, white blue hair clinging to her face, but her eyes were open. Alive, he wrapped an arm around her. "Can you hold on?" he asked. She didn't speak, just nodded. He braced himself against the wall and began the climb, gritting his teeth. The rope burned his palms. His leg flared with every upward pull, but inch by inch they rose it. Took the better part of an hour. When they reached the rim, he collapsed, dragging her with him. She lay on the grass, blinking up at the sky, alive, breathing. Neither spoke for a long time. When she did, her voice cracked like dry twigs. "You're not one of them." He turned his head, squinting at her. "One of who? The ones who put me there?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in days, sleep took her. Built a fire, found a tin of beans in his saddlebag, and set them near the flames. He didn't know who she was, not yet, but he'd seen girls like her before. The war had churned through towns like a plague, leaving the strong twisted and the weak dead. She'd survived something awful. He didn't need to ask later. As night fell, she woke again. The firelight made her face glow. She sat up, slow, trembling. "Your name?" he asked. "Clara Last Hargrove." He stiffened. The name rang a bell, faint, distant chew from Marlowe. She nodded, eyes dropping. Jed looked away, toward the fire. "Your father buried my boy 3 winters ago." Clara didn't answer, but something in her gaze shifted. A flicker of understanding, of shared grief. "You got folks?" he asked. She shook her head. "Where you headed?" "Nowhere." Jed nodded. "That makes 2 of us." They sat in silence again. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't sharp either. It was the silence of 2 people who'd run out of words long ago. In the distance, coyotes howled. Clara pulled the blanket tighter around her. Jed checked his revolver, then shifted his seat to face the open plains. He didn't trust her, not fully, but something about the girl pulled at the last thread of decency left in him. She hadn't begged. She hadn't screamed. She just held on, longer than anyone had a right to. The fire cracked. She shivered. He tossed her another blanket. She didn't thank him. She just accepted it. He respected that by dawn, the storm had passed. Not a weather storm, something worse. The storm of decision. Jed saddled his horse. Clara stood nearby, her legs wobbly but firm. She didn't ask where they were going. He didn't offer. They just rode south, toward the rising sun and away from the well. The prairie stretched endless before them, but behind them lay a darkness neither wanted to revisit. The well would remain, a grave that had failed a warning, a scar on the land. Jed didn't know what to make of the girl, but he knew this. He wasn't leaving her behind. She knew this. No one was throwing her down again, not ever. And as the horses' hooves carried them over the hill, the wind died down. The plains held their breath. Something had shifted too. Broken people were riding together now, and the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The road ahead was dust and wind, with nothing but silence to fill the spaces between hoofbeats. Clara rode behind Jed, her arms loosely wrapped around his waist. Not from affection, but necessity. Her body still ached from the ordeal in the well. Her hands blistered, ribs tender with every breath. Yet it wasn't pain that consumed her thoughts. It was the fact that she was still breathing. That someone, a stranger with a grim face and broken eyes, had pulled her from a place no one else would have searched. Jed said little, but in his silence there was clarity. He watched the horizon like a man who expected it to betray him at any moment. His revolver never strayed far from his fingers, even when they paused to let the horse drink or two. Rationed the dried meat and beans he kept in his saddlebag. His movements were careful. Alert Clara recognized it. The way her father had moved before the soldiers came. The way a man carried himself when he'd seen the world take things it had no right to touch. By the third day, they came to a stretch of land where prairie turned to red rock and sharp ridges. The land was wild, broken into jagged teeth that rose against the sky. There was no path. Jed seemed to know where he was going, or maybe he didn't, and just preferred places where no one else would follow. Clara didn't ask. She didn't want to know the names of the places he haunted. That night they camped in the lee of a stone bluff. The fire was small, hidden from sight by a ring of dry branches. Clara's dress had dried, though it still clung to her like memories. Had offered her an old canvas duster from his pack. She'd taken it without a word. It smelled like tobacco and weathered leather, like the inside of her father's church after the candles had all burned low. "You ever shoot?" Jed asked suddenly. His voice low. Clara looked up. No. He handed her a small revolver from his coat. It was old, worn, the metal dulled by years of use. "Not a toy," he said. "You pull this, you. Finish what you start." Her fingers closed around the grip. It was heavier than she expected. She held it, studied it, then passed it back. "I'll remember that." Jed didn't smile, but something shifted behind his eyes. Approval, maybe, or just the absence of disappointment. They slept in turns, one watching the fire while the other drifted. In the dark hours before dawn, Clara opened her eyes to find Jed sitting beside the embers staring at nothing. "Why'd you stop?" she asked. Jed looked at her slow and thoughtful. "What do you mean?" "By the well, you could have kept riding." He didn't answer at first. The fire cracked softly, casting shadows across his face. "Didn't feel right," he said finally. "Leaving someone to die alone doesn't sit well. You think I'd do the same for you?" "No," he said, "but that's not why I did it." She didn't respond. They watched the fire until it burned down to coals. By morning, the wind had picked up. Jed decided to move into a narrow canyon that cut through the ridge. It offered cover, but it also slowed their pace. The horse labored under their combined weight. And by midday Jed had Clara dismount and walk beside him. They'd only gone another mile when the shot rang out. Jed's hand was already on his gun. Before Clara dropped to the ground, he turned, scanning the high walls of the canyon. Another shot. The echo made it impossible to locate the shooter. Jed pushed Clara behind a boulder, ducked low, drew his revolver. "Stay down," he growled. She obeyed. Voices echoed from above, taunting, male, cruel. "Where you running, little preacher girl?" Someone called. "Thought the well would have kept you down." Jed swore under his breath. He peered up at the ridge. "How many?" Clara asked. "3, maybe 4. She recognized the voice. Boyd Anders, one of the men who dragged her from the chapel ruins, beat her until she couldn't stand a man who'd once worn a Confederate coat like armor, now wore it like a flag for chaos. "They want me," she said. "Figured I can give them something else." Jed glanced at her. "No, they'll keep coming. Let him." She didn't understand him. Not yet, but she saw in his face the same stubbornness that had filled her father's sermons. The same refusal to bow. Gunfire erupted again. This time closer. One of the bandits had found a lower path. Jed returned fire. A man screamed. "We move," he said. Grabbing Clara's arm, they climbed over the rocks, moving fast. The horse bolted in the chaos. Jed didn't try to call it back. It wouldn't have made it through the canyon anyway. They moved uphill, bullets skimming the rocks around them. Jed was quick. Even with his limp, Clara followed with the urgency of someone who'd learned what dying looked like. They reached a narrow ledge. Jed turned and fired again. Another scream, and silence they pressed on by dusk. The gunfire had stopped, but the tension hadn't. Jed found a crevice deep enough to hide in, where the wind couldn't reach, and the moonlight barely touched Clara's sank. Against the stone, heart-racing Jed checked his ammo. He had 4 rounds left. They'll follow us. Clara said, "Let him. You can't kill them all. Don't need to. Just need to make it not worth the cost." Clara studied him. "Why are you doing this?" Jed didn't answer. She tried again. "You don't even know me. I know enough that I'm hunted, or that I'm trouble. That you didn't scream in that well," he said. "Didn't beg. Most people would have lost their mind down there. You waited." She looked down at her hands, cracked and bruised. "I didn't have anything else. That's why you're still alive." For a long moment, they said nothing. Then Jed handed her the revolver again. "Tomorrow you learn to shoot." And she did. At first, her hands shook so badly she missed the can. He sat on a rock 10 feet away. Jed didn't scold her. He just made her reload again and again. By the 3rd day, she hit the can twice. By the 5th, she hit it every time she learned to reload without looking, to draw from her waistband to read the wind. They moved constantly, sleeping beneath overhangs and abandoned hunting shelters. Jed taught her how to lay false trails, how to boil water without smoke, how to tell when the air was about to change. He watched him memorized. Him, not just the skills, but the man beneath them. How he winced when he sat too long, how he paused before lighting a fire, like the flame might burn more than wood. How he looked at her sometimes, not with pity, but with something like hope, carefully. Buried, he never asked her what had happened the night they threw her into the well, and she never asked what had broken him, but something passed between them in the silence, a bond formed not by words, but by the shared understanding that the world didn't give second chances. It took, and then it took again, and the only thing you could do was survive with whatever pieces were left. One evening they found a cave dry hidden. Jed made a fire. Clara, stronger, now cleaned her own wounds. She was thinner, her face sharper, but her eyes clearer. "Jed," she asked. He looked up. "If you hadn't found me, would you have gone looking for someone else to save?" He didn't answer for a long time. "No," he said, "just you." They sat in silence, and the fire flickered. Higher the next morning, they found boot prints, fresh deep. The men were closing in. Jed stopped walking. He studied the ground, then turned to her. "This ends soon," he said. "You ready?" Clara nodded. "I'm not going back in that hole." He stared at her. "No, you're not." And for the first time Clara believed it. They climbed higher into the ridges, where the rocks formed natural barriers, and the wind made it hard to hear. Jed had a plan. He wouldn't say what, only that if it worked, the men chasing them would regret ever coming that night. As they prepared, Clara sat alone beneath a twisted pine tree. She looked up at the stars. She didn't pray. She didn't cry. She remembered her father's voice, her mother's hands, the way the water had felt when it closed over her, and she promised herself that no one would ever take her voice again. She rose tomorrow. There would be a reckoning, and she was ready for it. Dawn broke over the ridges like a blade drawn slow across the spine of the land. The wind had changed, cooler, now steadier. It carried the scent of pine and smoke, and something else beneath it. Tension, the kind you could feel on your skin. Clara crouched behind a curtain of brush, her eyes locked on the winding canyon trail below. Her hands, though still raw and calloused, held the revolver with growing certainty, not just muscle memory, conviction. Beside her, Jed Calloway adjusted his position, cradling his rifle. The days on the run had worn him thinner, more limping than walking, and yet there was a calm to him this morning, a kind of settled resolve. He knew what they were about to do. More importantly, he knew what it would cost the three men pursuing. Em had names now. Clara had spoken them quietly. The night before, not as a child recalling a nightmare, but as someone sharpening a knife. Boyd Anders, the one who'd dragged her by the hair into the fields Kemp, the one who'd spat on her father's. Grave and Will Patch, silent and cruel, who had pushed her into the well and laughed. They were close. Too close. Jed's plan was simple. Let the canyon work for them. Force the enemy into a narrow pass spring. The traps control the field. But plans are just promises to yourself. And in the wilderness, promises get broken. Jed turned to Clara. When they show, don't wait. Don't hesitate. I won't, she said. He looked her over as if seeing her for the first time, not as the girl he pulled from the dark, but as something forged by it. There was steel in her now and fire. He nodded once. Let's finish it. The canyon trail below twisted sharply into a choke point, a place where only one man could pass at a time. Jed had collapsed part of the slope the day before, setting at deadfall trap rocks, tied by rope, held back by a stick trigger. Clara had positioned herself across from it, with a clean view of the entry path. Jed took the higher ground rifle, balanced over a saddle of stone. By mid-morning they heard them voices, hooves, the faint jangle of spurs tracks. End up this way, Boyd called. Can't be far. Clara steadied her breathing. She felt it all, her heart, the tremor in her legs, but she did not move, not until they came into view. First was Kemp's rifle, slung lazy across his shoulder. He stepped into the narrow. Without caution, Clara squeezed the trigger. First shot struck his legs, spinning him down into the dirt. He screamed loud and shocked. Jed's rifle barked. Once clean, precise. Kemp's cry cut short. Ambush. Boyd shouted too late. The remaining two turned to run, but Jed pulled the trigger again. Will Patch ducked Dove behind a boulder. Boyd rolled into cover, cursing Clara, shifted eyes sharp, watching for movement. You goddamn preacher whore. Boyd's voice echoed off the walls. You think this makes you anything but dead. Jed's voice cut across the canyon, firm. It makes her free. The air hung heavy. The canyon, so full of noise moments ago, fell into stillness. Only the wind moved, and a gunshot rang out, not from above, but from behind. Jed flinched, dropped to a knee. Blood blossomed from his side. Clara's voice, cracked with shock. Boyd had circled up along the ridge, flanking them. Jed turned, fired blindly. Missed. Clara watched, horror flooding her veins as Jed fell behind the rocks. Stay down, he rasped. Clara didn't listen. She slid low, belly to stone, inching toward his position. She reached him, hands fumbling, pressing down on the bleeding. His face was pale, teeth clenched. You don't stop bleeding, she whispered. I'll drag you down that well myself. Jed gave a weak laugh. That's the spirit. Another shot ricocheted nearby. Boyd was moving, trying to finish what he'd started. Clara's mind raced. She grabbed the rifle from Yet's side, checked the chamber. One shot left. It would have to be enough. She peeked from cover, saw a flash of Boyd's coat as he shifted to another rock. She aimed. She fired. The bullet hit stone. Boyd laughed. At the best you got. Come on down, sweetheart. Let's end this where it started. She didn't answer. She stood up in full view. He hesitated, caught off guard. Then he raised his gun. Too late. A new shot rang out. Jed, bleeding and half conscious, had drawn his revolver from the dirt and fired with what strength he had left. The bullet caught Boyd in the gut. He dropped to his knees, mouth twisting, then slumped forward. Dead silence returned. Clara didn't move. Only when she was sure it was over did she run to Jed, falling beside him, checking his pulse. Still alive, barely. They spent the rest of that day sheltering in the rocks. Clara patched his wound with strips of her shirt. Boiled water forced him to drink. He faded in and out, murmuring names she didn't know, pieces of a life long gone. When night came, the sky opened in stars. Clara sat beside him, revolver in her lap, eyes open. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. 3 days passed before Jed could walk again, leaning on her shoulder, slow and steady. The horse miraculously found its way, back trailing close behind like it had been waiting. They mounted and rode east, not because there was a plan, but because it felt like the direction of healing. Clara had never seen the mountains that far, but Jed said they held rivers and small towns that minded their own. When they reached the edge of a pine valley, Clara saw at the glint of a roof in the distance. Smoke from a chimney, a town she looked back only once. Toward the ridges, the canyon, the wells she felt nothing weeks past, they found a small cabin to rent outside the town of Kestrel Hollow. Jed recovered slowly. Clara took odd jobs mending, cleaning, eventually tending horses. She was good with them. Gentle, quiet. The animals seemed to trust her. Jed built a new fence, grew tomatoes, even laughed once, a short bark of sound that startled them both. They never spoke of the well again, or the men. Some memories don't need to be kept in words, but they never forgot. One evening Clara stood by the porch, staring out at the sunset. Jed walked up beside her, leaning on the rail. "You still think about it?" he asked. "Every day? Does it get easier?" She thought for a long time. "No," she said. "But I get stronger." He nodded. "You did more than survive, Clara." She turned to him. "So did you?" He smiled. "Just a little. You made me want to." They stood there in silence as the sun dipped low and the sky turned gold. It wasn't peace. Not exactly. But it was something like a beginning. And for people like them, that was more than enough.